We continue today in Luke's gospel to follow Jesus through this series of parables and teachings. Last week, Jesus gave his disciples the example of the dishonest steward as this surprisingly positive model for how we are supposed to manage the resources we have in this life. And he warns us about how we should be using these earthly resources we have to prepare ourselves for eternity. Jesus then continues from that parable into this week's, the story of Lazarus and the rich man. And in putting these two parables together, what Jesus is doing is providing us with both sides of the same coin. The dishonest steward is our positive role model, and now the rich man becomes our negative example, an example of what happens if we don't do what the steward does. Now, it must be said that this parable is a lot easier to follow than the dishonest steward. We are introduced to two characters, the first being a man who is very well off. We are told he wears the most expensive designer clothes and dines only on the finest foods. And in fact, he has so much of this fine food made every single day that he can't even eat it all. And he thoughtlessly throws away the leftovers. Then in stark contrast, there is our second character, poor Lazarus, who has absolutely nothing. Nowhere to live. He lies at the gate of the rich man's house, hungry and sick, with open sores on his body, apparently too weak to even fend off the stray dogs licking at him. These two figures couldn't be more different, and yet here they are in close proximity. You can almost see the rich man stepping over Lazarus as he enters his mansion, consciously avoiding eye contact and thankful that his gate will keep the poor beggar out. But then Jesus tells us that death, that great equalizer, comes for both the rich man and the poor. And so we find these two figures in the afterlife, and we see how their fortunes have now been reversed. That poor come, and the rich man never bothered to be shrewd and make friends with the poor while he had the chance. So now, finding himself in the same position that Lazarus was in at his gate, the rich man calls out to Abraham to have Lazarus come and ease his suffering, just as Lazarus had hoped the rich man would do for him in life. Even more disturbing, though, the rich man apparently knows Lazarus's name. He knew the name of this sick and starving man at his gate, and still couldn't bother to share the scraps that fell off his table. And now, as he suffers from thirst, he still only sees Lazarus as a servant to him. and asks Abraham to command Lazarus to come to his aid. But we and the rich man are informed that it simply isn't possible to bridge the gulf that is now between them. Now, at this point, it's worth pointing out that as vivid as this image is of the afterlife, the point Jesus is making is not to give us a geography of heaven and hell. Remember, this is a parable, not a user manual on how the afterlife works. The point of this vivid imagery is to show us how the idol of wealth has corrupted the soul of the rich man. And so what we see is how his afterlife is shaped by the choices he made in life. This last summer, some of us read another parable of sorts about the afterlife, C.S. Lewis's novel, The Great Divorce. In it, hell is depicted as this sort of rainy, gray, and dull place. And the residents of hell simply continue to live as they did on earth. Well, practiced in the ways of self-centeredness, bitterness, anger, and hatred, none of which makes for particularly good neighbors. And so these residents of hell tend to continually move further and further away from one another. But in the center of hell, there is a bus line that any of them can take should they wish to go to heaven. Of course, many of the residents never even bother to make the trip, as they are too focused on building up their own private mansions in hell. And of those who do make the trip, many find it to not be to their liking at all. After all, heaven is a place defined by generosity, mercy, gratitude, and love. All of which are characteristics these people found distasteful in life. Why would we expect that to have suddenly changed in death? Even when the residents of heaven come and try to convince them to stay, we see how they are stuck in old habits. Just like how the rich man is still stuck in his habit of seeing Lazarus as a mere servant. The point in these parables of the afterlife, Jesus's and Lewis's, is that the coming judgment that Jesus warns us about is not something arbitrary. It's not just about getting on God's good side. Nor is it about a scale where a person's good deeds are weighed against their bad deeds, and if the bad deeds outweigh the good, then they are punished for it with fire and pitchforks, and if the good outweighs the bad, then they can earn a reward in the end. No, the truth of the matter is that the punishment has always been self-inflicted. Through a lifetime of habits, they have allowed themselves to become the kind of people who find the joys of heaven to be a terrible burden. The unquenchable fire of hell turns out to be our own loathing against love and mercy and righteousness. For the rich man in this parable, after a lifetime of choices and habits, he has allowed his soul to take on the shape of his idol. And so even in the afterlife, he simply plays out the same role he did on earth. He still sees Lazarus as beneath him, as only good for serving his own interests. What is actually revealed here in this afterlife is that his life has always, even with his fine clothes and rich foods, it has always been hell. This is why Jesus has such strong warnings about wealth, because it is so powerful a tool in meeting our needs, in providing comforts, and in elevating our status. It easily gives us illusions of being powerful ourselves. But that's exactly what makes wealth an idol. For it demands a sacrifice. Something of ourselves is demanded in pursuit of the false promises of control, self-sufficiency, and of pleasure. And the more we offer up of ourselves in worship of this idol, the more it takes its toll on our souls. For we become like whatever we worship. The rich man worshiped his wealth and became like it, eternally unsatisfied, with an unquenchable thirst for more, a hell that he fashioned for himself every time he chose to step over the frail and sick Lazarus on his way to rich feasts. But Jesus tells us it doesn't have to be that way. If the rich man had merely done what Paul suggests in 1 Timothy, if he had been shrewd with his wealth and let go of its false security, if instead he had built up the righteous habits of doing good works, of being generous and ready to share, then he, like the shrewd steward, could have made Lazarus his friend. And they could have gone together, hand in hand, into paradise. His thirst could have been quenched by he who is the very fountain of living water.